Are you ready to fall asleep with 100 interesting facts from 1940s America? Let's begin. 1. 1941. Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II. In December of 1941, life in the United States shifted in a single morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked a nation that had largely watched the growing conflict from across the oceans. Almost overnight, the mood turned from wary distance to determined participation. Families gathered around radios to hear the news, and by the next day, President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech had made clear that America was at war. For many, it meant husbands, sons, and brothers preparing to enlist, while wives, mothers, and sisters readied themselves for changes on the home front. The event became one of those shared memories where people remembered exactly where they were when they heard. Streets buzzed with hurried footsteps, store windows filled with patriotic displays, and newspapers sold out quickly as citizens sought every detail. The attack was devastating, but it also united Americans with a sense of purpose that carried through the decade. 2. Victory gardens feeding millions. As the war stretched resources thin, ordinary Americans found creative ways to contribute. One of the most beloved efforts was the planting of victory gardens. These homegrown patches of vegetables sprouted up in backyards, vacant lots, and even city rooftops. Families who had never tended soil before began planting beans, tomatoes, and carrots, guided by government pamphlets and neighborhood clubs. School children pulled weeds beside their parents, learning both patience and pride in their labor. By growing food at home, families eased pressure on the agricultural system, ensuring that more commercial crops could be sent overseas to feed soldiers and allies. At the height of the movement, millions of households across the country participated, producing nearly half of the vegetables consumed in the United States. More than just a practical measure, victory gardens offered comfort, a reminder that even in difficult times, nurturing life and sharing meals could be a quiet act of resistance and hope. 3. Ration books and coupons for sugar, meat, and gasoline. Every household in 1940s America became familiar with the small booklets that determined what could be purchased each week. Ration books, issued by the government, contained stamps and coupons that limited access to essential goods like sugar, meat, butter, coffee, and gasoline. Families carefully planned meals around what their stamps allowed, and homemakers became experts at stretching ingredients. A pound of sugar had to last, so desserts became special occasion treats rather than everyday indulgences. Meat was precious, leading to creative uses of every cut and the rise of casseroles and stews that could feed more people with less. Gas rationing meant fewer Sunday drives and more carpooling to work. Black market dealings emerged, but most Americans took pride in following the rules, seeing it as their contribution to the war effort. The ration book became a symbol of shared sacrifice, a tangible reminder that everyone had a role to play in supporting the troops overseas. 4. Rosie the Riveter and women in factories. She wore a bandana, flexed her arm, and declared, "We can do it." Rosie the Riveter became the face of a massive shift in American society, as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. With millions of men overseas fighting, factories desperately needed workers to produce planes, ships, tanks, and ammunition. Women answered the call, trading aprons for coveralls and learning to operate heavy machinery, weld metal, and assemble complex equipment. These weren't just single women looking for adventure. Mothers, wives, and grandmothers clocked in for long shifts, proving they could handle physically demanding work that many had assumed only men could do. The aircraft factories, shipyards, and munitions plants hummed with their labor. For many women, the work brought not just a paycheck but a sense of capability and independence they'd never experienced before. Though the war's end would complicate these gains, the image of Rosie planted seeds that would grow into future movements for women's rights and workplace equality. 5. War bond posters across neighborhoods. Everywhere you looked in 1940s America, colorful posters urged citizens to buy war bonds. These appeared in post offices, banks, movie theaters, and shop windows, featuring bold graphics and patriotic slogans. Celebrities like Bette Davis and Bob Hope promoted bond drives at rallies, and school children participated in programs where they could purchase stamps that would eventually add up to a full bond. The government needed to finance the massive war effort, and bonds offered everyday Americans a way to invest in victory while setting aside savings for the future. A $25 bond would mature to be worth more years later, making it both a patriotic gesture and a practical investment. Communities competed to see who could sell the most bonds, with thermometer-style charts displayed in town squares showing progress toward local goals. Buying bonds became a point of pride, a way to feel directly connected to supporting soldiers abroad while planning for peacetime prosperity. 6. The draft and the GI. Experience. When the Selective Training and Service Act went into effect, millions of young American men registered for the draft. The lottery system meant that any day, a letter could arrive summoning a son or husband to report for service. Families experienced a mixture of pride and fear as their loved ones left for training camps and then deployment to Europe, the Pacific, or North Africa. The GI experience transformed these men, many of whom had never traveled far from their hometowns. They endured grueling training, formed bonds with fellow soldiers that would last lifetimes, and faced the harsh realities of combat. Letters home were carefully worded to avoid worry, censored by military officials, yet they remained lifelines connecting soldiers to the world they'd left behind. The experience shaped an entire generation, and when they returned, the GI Bill would help many pursue education and home ownership, fundamentally changing the American middle class. 7. Scrap drives. Kids collecting tin, rubber, paper. Children in the 1940s found themselves with an important mission: collecting scrap materials that could be recycled into weapons and equipment. Schools, organized competitions, and neighborhoods buzzed with kids, pulling wagons filled with flattened tin cans, old newspapers, rubber tires, and metal scraps. Even kitchen grease was saved and donated, as it could be used to make explosives. Families stripped their homes of excess metal, donating old pots, gates, and decorative iron. The drives gave children a tangible way to contribute to the war effort, making them feel like they were doing something important rather than just waiting at home. Posters reminded them that their pile of cans could become part of a tank or airplane. The enthusiasm was real, and the competition fierce, with schools tracking totals and celebrating the classes that collected the most. These drives taught a generation about resourcefulness and community effort, lessons that would stay with them long after the war ended. 8. Office of Price Administration controlling costs. To prevent runaway inflation and price gouging during wartime shortages, the federal government established the Office of Price Administration. This agency set maximum prices on most goods and controlled rents in defense areas where workers flooded in to take factory jobs. Store owners had to display price ceilings, and consumers learned to watch for violations. The OPA became one of the most controversial wartime agencies, with business owners often frustrated by restrictions and consumers sometimes irritated by shortages, despite the controls. Enforcement was challenging, requiring local price boards and volunteers to monitor compliance. Black markets inevitably emerged for those willing to pay more than legal prices, but most Americans respected the system as necessary for fairness. The agency's reach into daily commerce was unprecedented in peacetime memory, marking a dramatic expansion of government involvement in the economy. When the war ended and controls began lifting, the debate over their effectiveness and appropriateness continued, foreshadowing future arguments about government regulation. 9. Blackouts and air raid drills in coastal cities. Along both coasts, particularly in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle, residents grew accustomed to the sound of air raid sirens and the sight of civil defense wardens patrolling neighborhoods. Blackout curtains became standard household items, pulled tight at night to ensure no light escaped that could guide enemy aircraft or submarines. When the sirens wailed, families hurried to turn off every lamp and crouch away from windows, waiting in darkness until the all-clear sounded. Though no enemy planes ever bombed the mainland, the threat felt real enough, especially in the war's early days when Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific coast and German U-boats hunted in the Atlantic. Children learned to recognize different siren patterns in school, and drills became as routine as fire drills. These exercises kept the distant war feeling immediate and reminded civilians that vigilance mattered. The wardens, often volunteers too old or unfit for military service, took their duties seriously, knocking on doors where light showed and ensuring everyone followed protocols. 10. The emotional impact of letters from the front. Perhaps nothing defined the home front experience more than waiting for letters from loved ones overseas. Mail call was a sacred time for soldiers, and back home, families rushed to the mailbox with equal anticipation. A letter meant your soldier was alive as of the writing, even if weeks had passed before delivery. Mothers read and reread the same pages, searching between lines for what couldn't be said due to censorship. The cheerful tone of most letters masked the hardships soldiers endured, as few wanted to burden their families with the full truth of combat. Some families dreaded the telegraph, knowing it brought only urgent news, usually tragic. When letters stopped coming, the anxiety was excruciating. Wives and parents wrote back constantly, filling pages with news of home, weather, neighbors, and everyday details, trying to give soldiers something normal to hold on to. These letters became treasured possessions, carefully stored in boxes and drawers, physical proof of love across impossible distances. The emotional toll of separation weighed heavily, but the letters provided hope and connection that helped families endure the long years of war. Meanwhile, life in entertainment kept spirits alive. 11. Radio shows, bringing families together. In the 1940s, the radio was the centerpiece of American living rooms, and families planned their evenings around favorite programs. Shows like The Shadow, Fibber McGee and Molly, and The Lone Ranger captivated audiences who gathered in semicircles around the wooden console, listening intently to voices and sound effects that sparked their imaginations. Sunday nights meant Jack Benny, whose timing and wit made millions laugh in unison across the country. Soap operas kept housewives company during afternoon chores, while evening dramas provided escape from wartime worries. The radio didn't just entertain, it informed, with news broadcasts becoming essential listening as families tracked the war's progress. President Roosevelt's fireside chats came through those speakers, his reassuring voice reaching into homes and making citizens feel personally addressed. Children had their own adventure serials, often sponsored by cereal companies offering decoder rings and secret society memberships. The shared experience of listening created a national conversation, with neighbors discussing plot twists and favorite characters the next day. 12. Big band swing and dance halls. The music of the 1940s swung with an infectious energy that got people moving despite wartime hardships. Big bands led by Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie filled dance halls with sounds that ranged from romantic ballads to upbeat numbers, perfect for the jitterbug and Lindy Hop. Young couples dressed in their finest and headed to venues where live bands played until late, the dance floor packed with swirling skirts and synchronized steps. The music reflected both the joy of youth and the bittersweet awareness that soldiers on leave might soon return to battle. Glenn Miller's In the Mood and Moonlight Serenade became anthems of the era, played at USO dances where servicemen and women found brief moments of normalcy. When Miller's plane disappeared over the English Channel in 1944, the nation mourned not just a band leader but a symbol of the era's spirit. Dance halls became places where people could forget troubles for a few hours, connected by rhythm and the simple pleasure of movement. 13. Hollywood's golden age and escapist films. Movie theaters offered affordable escape during the 1940s, and Hollywood rose to the occasion with films that transported audiences far from wartime realities. Musicals with Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney brought color and song to the screen. Romantic comedies starring Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn showcased witty banter and glamorous settings. Epic dramas and film noir emerged as distinctly 40s genres, with Casablanca becoming perhaps the decade's most iconic film, its themes of sacrifice and love resonating deeply with audiences who understood those tensions personally. Theaters also showed newsreels before the main feature, bringing images of the war to communities far from battle. Matinees cost a quarter or less, making movies accessible to nearly everyone. Actors like Humphrey Bogart, Bette Davis, and James Stewart became household names, their faces on magazine covers and their voices imitated by children at play. For 2 hours in a darkened theater, Americans could forget ration books and worry, lost in stories that reminded them what they were fighting for. 14. Comic books and superhero patriotism. Children and soldiers alike found entertainment in the colorful pages of comic books, which exploded in popularity during the 1940s. Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman had debuted in the late 30s, but the war years saw these heroes explicitly fighting Axis powers. Captain America punched Hitler on his first cover, and comics became unabashedly patriotic, with superheroes buying war bonds and encouraging readers to support scrap drives. The affordability of comics, just 10 cents, made them perfect entertainment for kids with limited allowance money. Soldiers carried them overseas, the bright pages and simple stories providing comfort and a connection to home. Trading comics became a social activity in neighborhoods and schoolyards, with certain issues highly prized. Parents and teachers sometimes worried about their influence, but most saw them as harmless fun. the industry boomed, with companies producing millions of copies monthly. These stories of clear-cut heroes defeating evil villains resonated in an era when the world truly seemed divided between good and bad, and they shaped the imaginations of an entire generation. 15. Crooners and Sinatra mania. While big bands dominated dance halls, a new style of male vocalist emerged to capture hearts, particularly female ones. Frank Sinatra rose from Tommy Dorsey's band to become a solo sensation, and the phenomenon of screaming, fainting Bobby Soxers at his concerts became a cultural marker of the decade. His smooth, intimate singing style felt personal, as if he were singing directly to each listener. Other crooners like Bing Crosby had already established themselves, and Crosby's White Christmas became the best-selling single of the era, its nostalgic longing perfectly capturing the mood of wartime separations. Perry Como and Nat King Cole added their distinctive voices to the airwaves. These singers represented a shift from the collective experience of swing dancing to the more individual, emotional connection of listening to a voice that seemed to understand your feelings. For young women, these crooners became objects of intense devotion, their photos pinned to bedroom walls and their records played repeatedly on home phonographs. 16. The growth of jazz and bebop. While swing remained popular with mainstream audiences, the 1940s also saw jazz musicians pushing boundaries and creating new sounds. Bebop emerged in clubs like Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, where innovators like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk experimented with complex harmonies, rapid tempos, and improvisation that challenged listeners. This wasn't music for dancing. It demanded active listening and appreciation of technical virtuosity. The bebop movement represented a shift in jazz from entertainment to art form, with musicians asserting their creative independence. Not everyone appreciated the new sound. Some found it chaotic or pretentious, but it attracted a devoted following of hipsters and intellectuals. The racial dynamics were complex too, as black musicians created sophisticated art that defied stereotypes while still facing discrimination in housing, hotels, and even some venues where they performed. Jazz clubs became spaces where racial boundaries blurred slightly, though never disappeared, as music lovers of different backgrounds came together to hear these revolutionary sounds. 17. Broadway musicals and Rodgers and Hammerstein. The 1940s marked a golden age for Broadway, with musical theatre reaching new heights of sophistication and integration between story and song. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II revolutionized the form with Oklahoma in 1943, creating a musical where songs advanced the plot rather than just providing entertainment breaks. The show's success was enormous, running for over 2,000 performances and changing what audiences expected from musicals. They followed with Carousel in 1945, tackling darker themes while maintaining emotional depth and memorable melodies. Other successful shows like On the Town brought energy and contemporary urban life to the stage. For those who couldn't afford tickets or lived far from New York, touring companies brought Broadway shows to cities across America, and cast recordings allowed families to enjoy the music at home. Theatre provided a more elite form of entertainment than movies, but its influence rippled outward, shaping American culture's understanding of storytelling, romance, and what live performance could achieve. 18. Pulp magazines and detective stories. Before television dominated leisure time, pulp magazines filled newsstands and drugstore racks with lurid covers and gripping stories. These cheaply produced publications offered detective tales, science fiction, westerns, and adventure stories for 10 or 15 cents. Writers like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett crafted hard-boiled detective fiction that created a distinctly American noir sensibility, with cynical private eyes navigating corrupt cities. Science fiction pulps published early work by Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury, stories that imagined futures shaped by technology and space travel. The paper was rough, the printing sometimes smudged, but the stories transported readers to different worlds. Soldiers read them in barracks and foxholes, the portable magazines easy to carry and pass around. Critics dismissed pulps as lowbrow entertainment, yet they incubated talent and genres that would later be recognized as literature. For working-class readers especially, pulps provided affordable entertainment and escape, their sensational stories offering thrills that everyday life rarely delivered. 19. Pin-up girls and Betty Grable. One of the most iconic images of the 1940s was Betty Grable in a white bathing suit, looking over her shoulder with a smile. This pin-up photo was reproduced millions of times, and adorned the lockers and walls of servicemen around the world. Pin-up girls like Grable, Rita Hayworth, and later Marilyn Monroe represented an idealized version of the girl back home, beautiful, wholesome, and waiting. These images served morale purposes, giving soldiers something pretty to look at and daydream about during brutal conditions. The poses were suggestive but never explicit, maintaining a line between allure and propriety that matched the era's standards. Artists like Alberto Vargas and Gil Elvgren created illustrated pin-ups for magazines like Esquire, their painted beauties even more idealized than photographs. The phenomenon raised questions about objectification even then, though few voiced concerns loudly during wartime. For the women whose images became famous, it meant both opportunities and being forever associated with a specific kind of appeal. The pin-up became a cultural artifact representing the decade's attitudes toward femininity, beauty, and the male gaze. 20. USO shows and entertaining the troops. Bob Hope became synonymous with USO entertainment, traveling to war zones and bases around the world to bring laughter and a taste of home to servicemen. The United Service Organizations formed in 1941 to provide morale and recreation services to the military. Hope led troops that included actresses, singers, and dancers who performed in makeshift theaters, on outdoor stages, and anywhere soldiers gathered. These weren't glamorous tours. Performers faced danger, discomfort, and exhaustion, but they persisted because they saw how much it meant to troops. A pretty actress signing autographs, or a comedian telling jokes about military life, could lift spirits for days. Other entertainers like Marlene Dietrich, Mickey Rooney, and the Andrews Sisters also devoted time to USO work. Back home, USO clubs in cities near military bases provided spaces for servicemen on leave to dance, eat, and relax in wholesome environments, often staffed by volunteers. The organization embodied civilian support for the military, a bridge between home and the harsh realities of war. As entertainment lifted spirits, science and technology were rapidly advancing. 21. The Manhattan Project and the Atomic Age. In secret facilities across the United States, scientists worked on the most consequential project of the decade, developing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project brought together brilliant minds including J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and many others in a race to harness nuclear fission before Germany could. Towns like Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, swelled with scientists, engineers, and support staff, all sworn to secrecy about their work. Families lived in these isolated communities, knowing only that they were contributing to something important for the war effort. The successful Trinity test in July of 1945 proved the weapon's terrible power, and weeks later, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan but ushering in the nuclear age. The implications were immediately understood as both miraculous and terrifying. Humanity now possessed the means to destroy itself. The scientists who created the bomb wrestled with moral questions for the rest of their lives, and the world suddenly had to navigate a new reality where warfare could mean extinction. 22. Penicillin saving lives. One of the decade's most important medical advances was the mass production of penicillin, the antibiotic discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but not produced at scale until the 1940s. Pharmaceutical companies worked intensely to manufacture enough penicillin to treat wounded soldiers, preventing infections that would have meant death or amputation in previous wars. The drug worked almost miraculously against bacterial infections, saving countless lives on battlefields and in hospitals. By mid-decade, production had increased enough that penicillin became available for civilian use as well, revolutionizing treatment of pneumonia, scarlet fever, and other previously deadly infections. Doctors called it a wonder drug, and patients who would have died from infected wounds instead recovered fully. The success of penicillin spurred research into other antibiotics, launching an era of pharmaceutical development that would transform medicine. Parents who had lived in fear of infections that could kill their children suddenly had reason for hope, and the age-old threat of dying from a simple cut or scratch began to recede. 23. Radar technology and detection systems. Radar, radio detection, and ranging became one of the war's most important technologies, giving Allied forces a crucial advantage in detecting enemy aircraft and ships. The British had developed radar before the war, and its use during the Battle of Britain helped defend against German bombing raids. American engineers improved and miniaturized the technology, installing radar systems on ships and planes. The ability to see objects beyond visual range changed naval and air warfare fundamentally. turning what had been surprise attacks into anticipated events that could be countered. Radar operators, many of them young women in the military, learned to interpret the glowing blips on screens, their vigilance saving countless lives. After the war, radar technology found civilian applications in weather forecasting, air traffic control, and eventually everyday devices. The same principles that detected enemy bombers would later help predict storms and guide commercial aircraft safely. Radar represented the kind of rapid technological advancement that war accelerated, with peacetime benefits emerging from military necessity. 24. The Jeep and military vehicle innovation. The Willys MB, better known simply as the Jeep, became one of the war's most recognizable and versatile vehicles. Designed to be lightweight, durable, and capable of handling rough terrain, the Jeep could transport soldiers, supplies, and equipment anywhere from European roads to Pacific jungles. It served as an ambulance, reconnaissance vehicle, and mobile gun platform. Soldiers loved the Jeep for its reliability and adaptability, and its simple design meant that even untrained mechanics could often make field repairs. The American automobile industry, converted entirely to war production, manufactured hundreds of thousands of these vehicles, along with tanks, trucks, and aircraft. This massive industrial output demonstrated American manufacturing capacity and provided the material means for Allied victory. After the war, surplus Jeeps found civilian use on farms and in rural areas, and the design influenced the development of sport utility vehicles decades later. The Jeep became an enduring symbol of American ingenuity and the can-do spirit of the era. 25. Synthetic rubber and material substitutes. When Japan captured Southeast Asian rubber plantations early in the war, the United States faced a critical shortage of natural rubber needed for tires, seals, and countless military applications. This crisis spurred a crash program to develop synthetic rubber, bringing together chemists, engineers, and industry in an urgent collaboration. By 1943, American factories were producing synthetic rubber in massive quantities, ensuring that the war machine didn't grind to a halt for lack of tires. The program succeeded through government coordination of research, rapid construction of production facilities, and willingness to share patents and information across competing companies. Other synthetic materials also emerged from wartime necessity. Nylon, which had been introduced just before the war for stockings, was redirected to parachutes and rope. Plastics began replacing metal and wood in various applications. These material innovations continued after the war, changing consumer products and manufacturing. The success of synthetic rubber proved that American industrial and scientific capacity could solve seemingly insurmountable problems when properly mobilized. 26. Aviation advances and jet engines. The 1940s witnessed revolutionary advances in aviation, driven by military demands but with implications far beyond warfare. Aircraft became faster, flew higher, and carried heavier loads than anyone had thought possible at the decade's start. The development of pressurized cabins allowed flight at altitudes where enemy fighters and weather posed less threat. Range increased dramatically, with bombers like the B-29 Superfortress capable of missions spanning thousands of miles. Most significantly, jet engines emerged late in the war, with German and British jets seeing limited combat. The jet engine represented a fundamental shift from propeller-driven flight, promising speeds that would eventually make long-distance travel routine. American engineers studied captured German jet technology and accelerated their own programs. By decade's end, the foundation was laid for the jet age that would transform both military and commercial aviation in the 1950s. The war had compressed decades of aeronautical development into a few intense years. 27. Computers and code-breaking machines. Though few Americans knew it at the time, the 1940s marked the birth of the computer age. In Britain, mathematician Alan Turing and his colleagues at Bletchley Park developed machines to break German Enigma codes, work that remained classified for decades but proved crucial to Allied victory. In the United States, the ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, was developed at the University of Pennsylvania to calculate artillery firing tables. Completed in 1946, ENIAC filled a large room, used thousands of vacuum tubes, and could perform calculations far faster than any human. It was programmed by women mathematicians who figured out how to make the machine solve complex problems. These early computers were massive, expensive, and limited in capability, but they demonstrated that electronic machines could perform logical operations and calculations. The theoretical groundwork was being laid for the digital revolution, though it would take decades before computers became small and affordable enough for widespread use. The 40s planted seeds that would transform society in ways even the inventors couldn't fully imagine. 28. Blood banks and plasma development. Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon, revolutionized blood storage and transfusion during the early 1940s. His research on blood plasma, the liquid portion of blood that can be dried and stored, made it possible to save countless lives on battlefields far from hospitals. Plasma could be transported, stored for extended periods, and administered without the need for blood type matching, making it ideal for emergency treatment of wounded soldiers. Drew organized the first large-scale blood bank programs, working with the Red Cross to collect and process blood donations from civilians. Ironically, policies of the time segregated blood by donor race, a practice Drew opposed as scientifically baseless. Blood drives became common on the home front, with citizens lining up to donate, knowing their contribution might save a soldier's life. The infrastructure and knowledge developed during the war established blood banking as standard medical practice, and plasma remained crucial for treating trauma patients long after the war ended. Drew's work saved innumerable lives despite the racial prejudice of the era. 29. Insecticides and DDT. DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, emerged in the 1940s as a powerful insecticide that seemed like a miracle for public health. First synthesized earlier, its insecticidal properties were discovered by Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller, who won a Nobel Prize for the work. The military used DDT extensively to control mosquitoes, carrying malaria and lice, spreading typhus, protecting soldiers in tropical and Mediterranean combat zones. Civilian applications quickly followed, with DDT sprayed in neighborhoods to control mosquitoes, used on farms to protect crops, and even applied directly on people to kill lice. It was considered so safe and beneficial that trucks drove through residential streets fogging entire neighborhoods while children played in the mist. The dramatic reduction in mosquito-borne diseases seemed to validate DDT's value. Only decades later would scientists understand the environmental and health consequences of widespread DDT use, including its persistence in ecosystems and effects on wildlife. In the 40s, though, it represented scientific progress and humanity's growing power to control nature for our benefit. 30. Advances in surgical techniques. Military necessity drove rapid advances in surgical techniques during the 1940s. Battlefield medicine improved dramatically as surgeons dealt with wounds from new weapons and had to operate under difficult conditions. The concept of mobile hospitals close to front lines meant that wounded soldiers received treatment faster, improving survival rates. Techniques for treating burns, removing shrapnel, repairing blood vessels, and dealing with traumatic amputations advanced quickly through terrible necessity. Plastic surgery developed new methods for reconstructing faces and bodies damaged by combat. These medical advances didn't stay on battlefields. They came home with military doctors who applied their hard-won knowledge to civilian practice. Anesthesia improved, sterilization techniques became more reliable, and surgical procedures that had been risky became routine. The war created a generation of surgeons with experience handling trauma that few doctors in peacetime would encounter in entire careers, and they trained the next generation with this expertise. Medical schools incorporated these advances, raising the standard of surgical care across the country. While science advanced rapidly, daily life had its own rhythms and realities. 31. A loaf of bread cost 10 cents. The price of everyday items in the 1940s reflected an economy dramatically different from today. A loaf of bread cost around 10 cents, fresh from the bakery with a crispy crust and soft interior. A quart of milk ran about 15 cents when delivered to your doorstep by the milkman, who arrived in early morning hours leaving glass bottles that families rinsed and returned. A dozen eggs might cost 50 cents, and a pound of ground beef sold for around 30 cents, though rationing often limited how much you could buy regardless of price. The Office of Price Administration worked to keep costs stable and prevent inflation from spiraling during wartime shortages. A gallon of gasoline cost around 15 cents when you could get it, and had ration stamps to spare. These prices seem impossibly low until you remember that average wages were also much lower. A factory worker might earn $30 to $40 per week. Families budgeted carefully, and every penny counted. The cost of living was modest, but so was income, requiring careful household management and making luxuries truly special. 32. The milkman's morning rounds. Long before supermarkets dominated food shopping, the milkman was a regular presence in American neighborhoods. His truck or horse-drawn wagon arrived in early morning darkness, and the familiar clink of glass bottles announced his presence. Customers left empty bottles on their porches and notes in the bottle carrier, specifying tomorrow's order: 2 quarts of whole milk, 1 of cream, a dozen eggs if available. The milkman knew his route and his customers, often for years, and would sometimes leave extra when he knew a family was having guests or skip a delivery if they'd left a vacation notice. Milk arrived fresh from local dairies, often with cream rising to the top by afternoon, requiring a shake before pouring. Children sometimes rushed out to grab the bottles before school, the glass cold with condensation. This system of home delivery represented a more personal economy, where service providers knew their customers individually. The milkman was one of several regular visitors: the iceman, the breadman, the vegetable peddler, who brought goods directly to homes before refrigeration, and cars made weekly shopping trips practical. 33. Party line telephones. Many American households in the 1940s shared telephone service through party lines, where multiple families used the same physical line. Each family had a distinctive ring pattern, 2 shorts and a long, or 3 shorts, or some other combination that told them when a call was meant for them. The system required cooperation and courtesy, as you couldn't make calls when neighbors were using the line, and it was possible, though considered rude, to pick up and listen to others' conversations. Important calls might be delayed if a chatty neighbor was tying up the line, and emergencies created social pressure for whoever was talking to quickly hang up. The party line operator knew everyone in the community and often served as an informal information hub, connecting callers and sometimes relaying messages. Privacy was limited, and gossips could learn neighborhood business by eavesdropping. As phone service expanded and improved throughout the decade, private lines became more common, but many rural areas and less affluent families continued using party lines well into the 50s. The system reflected a more communal society, where privacy was less expected and neighbors were more interdependent. 34. Ice boxes and ice delivery. Before electric refrigerators became standard, many households kept food cold in ice boxes, insulated cabinets with a compartment for a large block of ice. The iceman delivered these blocks regularly, carrying them with large tongs and placing them in the upper compartment, where melting ice slowly dripped into a pan below that had to be emptied regularly. A card in the window indicated how much ice the family needed: 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds, depending on the season and circumstances. Children followed the ice wagon on hot summer days, begging for chips to suck on. The icebox worked reasonably well but required daily attention and couldn't keep things as cold as modern refrigerators. Families planned meals around what needed to be used before it spoiled, and shopping happened more frequently in smaller amounts. Electric refrigerators were becoming more common and affordable through the decade, representing a significant leap in convenience and food safety. By the late 40s, refrigerators with freezer compartments were increasingly common in middle-class homes, changing meal planning and food storage forever. 35. Victory mail and V-mail letters. To save shipping space and weight on cargo ships crossing the Atlantic and Pacific, the military developed victory mail, or V-mail. Soldiers and their families wrote letters on special forms that were then photographed onto microfilm, dramatically reducing the physical size and weight. The microfilm was shipped overseas, then printed at reduced size and delivered. A V-mail letter ended up much smaller than the original, with tiny handwriting that sometimes challenged older eyes. The system allowed more letters to reach troops more quickly, despite limited cargo space. A single mail bag of V-mail microfilm could hold the equivalent of 37 bags of regular letters. Families became accustomed to the thin, odd-sized sheets arriving from overseas. Writing V-mail required certain discipline. You had one sheet to say everything, and poor handwriting might be illegible once reduced. The system represented another wartime innovation born of necessity, a way to maintain morale and connection despite logistical challenges. Even something as simple as letter writing had to adapt to the demands of global war. 36. Corner drugstores and soda fountains. The neighborhood drugstore was a social hub in 1940s America, far more than just a place to fill prescriptions. The soda fountain, with its marble counter and spinning stools, offered ice cream sodas, phosphates, malted milkshakes, and egg creams mixed to order by a soda jerk in a paper cap. Teenagers gathered after school to share a float or a sundae, playing the jukebox and flirting. The drugstore also stocked magazines, candy, cigarettes, cosmetics, toys, and various household goods, serving as a general store for the neighborhood. The pharmacist knew customers by name and might offer advice on minor ailments, recommending remedies from the shelves. Many drugstores had wooden phone booths where you could make private calls, and some had lending libraries where you could rent books. The atmosphere was welcoming, with ceiling fans stirring the air in summer and the sweet smell of ice cream mixing with paper and pharmacy scents. These establishments provided a third place between home and work, where community happened naturally, a role that would diminish as suburban shopping centers replaced neighborhood commercial streets. 37. Washing machines with ringers. Laundry day in the 1940s was arduous work, even for those fortunate enough to own a washing machine. These early machines were basic. An electric motor agitated clothes in soapy water in a tub, but you manually fed clothes through a wringer to squeeze out water before hanging them to dry. The wringer consisted of two rollers that pressed together, and feeding clothes through required care to avoid catching fingers or pulling buttons off. Many households still washed by hand using washboards and tubs, scrubbing vigorously to remove dirt and stains. Clothes were boiled for whites, and separate tubs were used for washing and rinsing. Lines strung in backyards or on apartment building roofs served as dryers, weather permitting. In winter, clothes froze stiff and had to be brought inside to thaw and finish drying. Monday was traditionally laundry day, and it consumed most of the day's labor. The development of automatic washers that could wash, rinse, and spin dry without manual intervention was eagerly anticipated, promising to free women from one of housework's most physically demanding tasks. 38. Home victory gardens in every yard. The victory garden movement became one of the war's most visible home front efforts, with an estimated 20 million gardens producing approximately 40% of America's vegetables. Backyards, vacant lots, school grounds, and even sections of public parks were converted to vegetable production. Families who had never gardened before learned from government pamphlets, agricultural extension agents, and experienced neighbors. Children helped plant seeds, pull weeds, and harvest produce, learning valuable lessons about where food comes from and the rewards of patient work. The gardens produced tomatoes, beans, lettuce, carrots, squash, and whatever else would grow in local climates. Canning and preserving the harvest became essential skills, with pressure cookers and mason jars appearing in kitchens everywhere. Communities shared surplus produce, and successful gardeners became neighborhood experts, offering advice and sometimes starter plants. The gardens served practical purposes, stretching ration points and supplementing family diets, but they also provided psychological benefits. Nurturing plants offered a sense of control and contribution during uncertain times, connecting people to the earth and to each other through a shared, peaceful endeavor. 39. Meatless Tuesdays and creative cooking. With meat rationed and often in short supply, home cooks became creative masters at stretching ingredients and creating satisfying meals from limited resources. Meatless days became common, with casseroles, soups, and egg dishes taking center stage. Recipes circulated for making a little meat go far hash, croquettes, and meat-extended dishes, where vegetables and breadcrumbs filled out the portions. Organ meats like liver and kidneys, previously less popular, appeared more frequently because they weren't rationed as strictly. Home cooks learned to make gravies and sauces that added flavor to simple dishes, and spices became more important as families explored different seasonings to vary tastes. Recipe columns in newspapers and women's magazines offered constant suggestions for ration-friendly meals, and neighbors shared tips over back fences. Desserts had to be made without much sugar, leading to creative uses of honey, molasses, and fruit. The constraints forced innovation, and many families discovered dishes they continued making even after rationing ended. The era created a generation of cooks who could make something from nothing, a skill born of necessity but valuable throughout their lives. 40. The Fuller Brush Man. Door-to-door salesmen were common in the 1940s, and perhaps none was more well known than the Fuller Brush Man. These traveling salesmen carried cases filled with brushes for every conceivable purpose: scrubbing floors, cleaning dishes, grooming hair, painting, dusting, and dozens of other household tasks. They knocked on doors throughout neighborhoods, demonstrating products to housewives who were their primary customers. A good salesman combined product knowledge with personality, building relationships with customers over repeat visits. The brushes were quality products, often lasting for years, making them worthwhile purchases. The Fuller Brush Man became part of American culture, referenced in movies and jokes, representing a particular kind of entrepreneurial spirit. For the salesmen themselves, it was commission-based work that could provide decent income for those who were persistent and personable. For housewives, the visits were sometimes welcome breaks in domestic routine, opportunities for adult conversation. Other door-to-door salesmen sold vacuum cleaners, encyclopedias, and various products. But Fuller Brush became the most iconic, a symbol of mid-century American commerce before malls and advertising replaced personal selling. Fashion and style reflected both wartime restrictions and creative adaptation. 41. Utility clothing and fabric rationing. The war affected fashion as surely as it affected food, with the government regulating fabric use to conserve materials for military needs. The War Production Board issued Limitation Order L, 85 inches 1942, restricting the amount of fabric in clothing. Skirts became shorter and narrower, ruffles and pleats were limited, and designers had to work within strict guidelines. Women's suits featured shorter jackets, and menswear used less fabric in trousers and coats. Despite these restrictions, or perhaps because of them, fashion became more practical and streamlined, inadvertently creating styles that would influence design for decades. Women couldn't buy silk stockings because silk went to parachutes, leading to the use of leg makeup that simulated stocking seams drawn up the back of bare legs with eyebrow pencil. Clothing was mended, altered, and made over to extend its life. Sewing skills became essential, as women made their own clothes and children's garments from patterns, sometimes repurposing old dresses and curtains. The motto, "Make, do, and mend," wasn't just practical advice but patriotic duty, connecting even fashion choices to the larger war effort. 42. The zoot suit controversy. While most Americans dressed conservatively within rationing restrictions, some young Mexican-American and African-American men adopted the zoot suit, a flamboyant style featuring high-waisted, wide-legged, tight-cuff trousers and a long coat with padded shoulders and wide lapels. The suits used excessive fabric in deliberate defiance of rationing restrictions, making them controversial and seen by many as unpatriotic. Wearers paired the suits with long watch chains and pork pie hats, creating a distinctive look associated with jazz clubs and urban youth culture. Tensions erupted in the zoot suit riots of June 1943 in Los Angeles, where white sailors and soldiers attacked young Latino men wearing the suits, stripping and beating them while police largely stood by. The riots exposed racial tensions and generational conflicts, with the suits becoming symbols of rebellion and ethnic identity. Though the style fell out of favor after the war, the zoot suit represented an important moment in American cultural history, illustrating how fashion could become political, and how marginalized communities use style to assert presence and identity despite mainstream disapproval. 43. Rosie's bandana and women's work fashion. The image of Rosie the Riveter, with her red and white polka dot bandana, became iconic, but it also represented real changes in how working women dressed. Factory work required practical clothing, pants or coveralls rather than dresses, hair secured to avoid machinery accidents, and sturdy shoes. Women adopted these masculine styles out of necessity, and many found them liberating after years of restrictive skirts and stockings. The bandana or hair scarf became ubiquitous, protecting hair from grease and machinery while allowing personal style through color and pattern choices. Some women wore makeup and jewelry, even to factory work, maintaining femininity in male-dominated spaces. This war-induced acceptance of women wearing pants gradually influenced civilian fashion, making trousers more socially acceptable for women outside work settings. The practical needs of wartime employment accelerated changes in women's fashion that might have taken decades otherwise. When men returned, and many women left factory jobs, they didn't entirely abandon the more comfortable, practical clothing they'd adopted, carrying forward a slow revolution in acceptable dress for women. 44. Men's fedoras and hats as necessities. No properly dressed man in the 1940s left home without a hat. Fedoras, with their snap brims and creased crowns, were the most popular style, along with Homburgs and Panama hats for summer. Men wore hats to work, to church, on dates, and for almost any public occasion. The hat was so essential that men felt partially dressed without one, and hat etiquette was strict. Remove it indoors, tip it to ladies, take it off during the national anthem. Hat stores were common, and men often owned several for different seasons and occasions. Felt fedoras in grey, brown, or black dominated cooler months, while straw boaters and Panama hats provided summer alternatives. The quality of a man's hat signaled his social status and attention to personal appearance, Hat-checking services existed in restaurants and theaters, where attendants took your hat and gave you a numbered ticket. Children learned proper hat etiquette from their fathers, understanding that how you wore and handled your hat reflected your character. By the late 40s, the dominance of hats was beginning its slow decline, but through most of the decade, a bare-headed man in public would have seemed as improperly dressed as someone without shoes. 45. Shoulder pads and strong silhouettes. Women's fashion in the 1940s emphasized broad shoulders and a strong, defined silhouette. Shoulder pads, originally popularized in the late 30s, reached their peak during the war years, creating a powerful, almost military bearing. Jackets and dresses featured structured shoulders that projected confidence and capability, perfectly suited to women's expanded roles in the workforce. The look was streamlined and practical, with narrow skirts and fitted bodices balancing the wide shoulders. This silhouette flattered most body types and created a sense of authority that served working women well. Even after the war, when some fashion trends shifted towards softer femininity, shoulder pads remained a staple. Designers like Adrian in Hollywood created dramatic shoulder treatments that influenced both fashion and costume design. The padded shoulder represented a decade when women's fashion acknowledged their strength and independence, even as society sent mixed messages about women's proper roles. The style would cycle in and out of fashion for decades, but its 40s incarnation remains distinctive and immediately recognizable. 46. Platform shoes and wedge heels. With leather rationed for military boots, shoe designers got creative with materials and styles. Platform shoes and wedge heels became fashionable partly because they used less leather, substituting cork, wood, and other materials for traditional heels and soles. These shoes raised the wearer's height while remaining more stable and comfortable than thin high heels. Women paired them with shorter skirts, creating a distinctive 40s look. The platforms could be quite high, sometimes 2 or 3 inches, decorated with colorful fabric, painted designs, or decorative nails. Carmen Miranda popularized extremely high platforms in her Hollywood films, pushing the style to theatrical extremes. For women working in factories, practical Oxford-style shoes or boots were necessary, but for social occasions, platforms and wedges offered glamour within wartime constraints. Shoe rationing meant most people owned only a few pairs, which had to be carefully maintained and resold when possible. Shoes became precious possessions, sometimes passed down or traded among family members, and the development of synthetic materials helped stretch limited leather supplies. 47. Victory rolls and pin curl hairstyles. Women's hairstyles in the 40s required effort and technique. Victory rolls, hair rolled and pinned into large curls, or waves framing the face, became the signature style, requiring pin curls, setting lotion, and considerable time. Women slept in pin curls wrapped in scarves, creating the foundation for next day's styling. Hair was generally worn at shoulder length or shorter, both for practicality and fabric conservation. Longer hair required more ribbon and accessories. Pompadour styles with height in front were popular, and many women visited beauty parlors weekly for professional setting. Home permanents became available, allowing women to create lasting waves without expensive salon treatments, though the chemicals sometimes damaged hair. African American women faced additional challenges with beauty standards and products rarely designed for their hair textures, often forced to use harsh straightening treatments. Hairdressing was serious business, with styles indicating social status and personal pride. Women who couldn't afford regular salon visits learned techniques from magazines and friends, transforming their bathrooms into beauty parlors with rollers, pins, and determination. 48. Costume jewelry and faux pearls. With precious metals directed to the war effort, costume jewelry flourished in the 1940s. Designers created elaborate pieces from base metals, glass, and plastics that allowed women to accessorize affordably, while real jewelry remained either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Chunky brooches, bold necklaces, and oversized earrings became fashionable, often with patriotic themes, flags, eagles, victory Vs. Faux pearls gained acceptance as fashionable rather than merely imitative, with many women preferring them to real pearls for everyday wear. Designers like Miriam Haskell created intricate costume pieces that were works of art in their own right, using seed pearls, rhinestones, and filigree to stunning effect. The democratization of jewelry meant working women could afford to own multiple pieces for different occasions, changing accessories to vary their limited wardrobes. Brooches served both decorative and practical purposes, closing coats and securing scarves. The acceptance of costume jewelry represented a shift away from jewelry as wealth display toward jewelry as artistic expression and personal style, a change that would permanently alter fashion. 49. Children's fashion and hand-me-downs. Children's clothing in the 40s was practical and meant to last, with the expectation that younger siblings would inherit garments from older ones. Mothers sewed many children's clothes at home, often using simplified patterns and whatever fabric was available. Little girls wore dresses most of the time, often with pinafores or aprons to protect the dress underneath. Boys wore short pants until around age 12, then graduated to long trousers, a rite of passage marking their approach to young adulthood. School clothes were distinct from play clothes, with children changing after school to preserve their better garments. Shoes were a particular concern. Children outgrew them constantly, but shoe rationing meant new ones weren't always available. Families sometimes stuffed toes with cotton or paper to extend wear time. Sunday best clothes were carefully maintained, worn only for church and special occasions. The concept of children's fashion as a commercial industry was limited. Practicality dominated aesthetic considerations. Children accepted that their clothes would be mended, altered, and eventually passed to younger siblings, participating in the broader culture of making do and conserving resources. 50. Makeup during wartime. Cosmetics faced their own wartime challenges, with metal tubes restricted and some ingredients difficult to obtain. Still, makeup remained important to many women, seen as maintaining morale and femininity during difficult times. Red lipstick became particularly symbolic, a bright spot of color and glamour that defied wartime austerity. Some shade names carried patriotic themes. Max Factor and other companies promoted makeup as a duty, arguing that looking attractive supported the war effort by maintaining spirits. Makeup techniques of the era emphasized defined lips, arched eyebrows, and clear skin. Foundation and powder were applied to create a matte, smooth complexion. Eyebrow pencils shaped and darkened brows into thin, arched lines. Blush was subtle, just a hint of color. The complete look required time and skill, with many women learning techniques from magazines or friends. For African American women, finding appropriate makeup shades remained challenging, as most companies didn't manufacture products for darker skin tones. Some women experimented with theatrical makeup or mixed their own shades. Beauty standards remained narrow and often Eurocentric, though diverse women found ways to participate in fashion and beauty culture, despite industries that often ignored them. Microtransition. Beyond fashion, Americans found joy in sports and leisure activities. 51. The All-American Girls Baseball League. With Major League Baseball losing players to military service, Chicago Cubs owner Philip K. Wrigley founded the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League in 1943. Teams with names like the Rockford Peaches, South Bend Blue Sox, and Kenosha Comets played real baseball, starting with a larger softball and gradually shifting to regulation baseballs, drawing impressive crowds in Midwestern cities. The women who played were serious athletes, but the league required them to wear skirts and maintain feminine appearances, attending charm school and following strict conduct codes. They played aggressive baseball, sliding, diving, and competing fiercely while looking like Hollywood's version of proper young women. Stars like Dottie Kamenchek became household names in their regions. The league proved women could play professional sports and draw paying audiences, though it struggled after the war when male players returned and cultural pressures pushed women back toward domestic roles. The league limped into the early 50s before folding, largely forgotten until decades later when its story was rediscovered and celebrated. These pioneering athletes played excellent baseball while navigating impossible expectations about femininity and athleticism. 52. Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak. In the summer of 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, Joe DiMaggio captured America's attention with one of baseball's most enduring records. The New York Yankees center fielder hit safely in 56 consecutive games, a streak that began modestly and built to a national obsession as it continued through May and June. Newspapers tracked it daily, and radio announcers updated fans on whether DiMaggio had hit yet. The streak's pressure intensified with each game, yet DiMaggio performed with grace and consistency, embodying the cool excellence that defined his career. When it finally ended in Cleveland on July 17, the country felt both disappointment and relief. The record still stands, considered by many as baseball's most unbreakable achievement. DiMaggio became more than a ball player. He was an American icon, though his fame would grow even larger after the war. His streak provided a summer's worth of positive news during anxious times, giving Americans something to follow that wasn't about war or politics. Baseball proved its value as the national pastime, offering continuity and joy when both were needed. 53. Boxing's golden age and Joe Louis. Boxing enjoyed tremendous popularity in the 1940s, and no fighter was bigger than heavyweight champion Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. Louis had held the title since 1937 and successfully defended it multiple times throughout the decade. His fights were major events, broadcast on radio to millions of listeners who gathered around sets to follow each round. Louis symbolized strength and dignity, particularly important as an African-American athlete in a segregated society. His knockout victory over German Max Schmeling in 1938 had been seen as symbolic of democracy defeating fascism. During the war, Louis served in the army, conducting exhibition matches and appearing in recruitment materials, using his fame to support the war effort. His generosity was legendary. He donated purses to military relief funds and visited troops. After the war, he continued defending his title before finally losing to Ezard Charles in 1950. Louis opened doors for black athletes while navigating the racial politics of his era with remarkable dignity. His cultural impact extended far beyond the ring. 54. College football's wartime adjustments. College football continued through the war years despite challenges. Many traditional programs lost players to military service, causing some schools to suspend their teams. Military training programs, stationed at universities, created unusual powerhouse teams. Servicemen training on campus remained eligible to play, sometimes forming all-star squads that dominated competition. The 1945 Army team, coached by Red Blake and featuring Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis in the backfield, went undefeated and is considered one of the greatest teams ever. Bowl games continued, providing entertainment and maintaining traditions. The Rose Bowl, normally played in Pasadena, moved to Durham, North Carolina, for 1942 due to West Coast security concerns following Pearl Harbor. Stadiums saw smaller crowds as gas rationing limited travel, and many young men were away, but football's continuation provided normalcy and a connection to pre-war life. High school football thrived, giving communities something to rally around. The sport's survival through the war years demonstrated its deep roots in American culture, and the post-war years would see football's popularity explode. 55. Horse racing and the Triple Crown. Horse racing remained popular entertainment in the 40s, with the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont Stakes comprising thoroughbred racing's Triple Crown. These events drew enormous crowds and betting action, offering excitement and the possibility of winning money during economically uncertain times. Whirlaway won the Triple Crown in 1941, and Count Fleet repeated the feat in 1943. Racetracks provided escapist entertainment, where dress-up occasions and social display mixed with genuine sport. The racing community included wealthy owners and breeders, but also working-class fans who followed horses religiously and bet modest amounts, hoping for big payoffs. Racing publications like the Daily Racing Form were studied intensely. Women attended in fashionable hats and dresses, making the track a social scene. War didn't interrupt racing as it did some sports, partly because horses couldn't enlist. Citation's 1948 Triple Crown victory became legendary, with the colt going on to become the first thoroughbred to win $1 million in earnings. Racing's combination of beauty, speed, gambling, and social ritual made it quintessentially American entertainment. 56. Bowling alleys and league nights. Bowling grew tremendously as a recreational activity during the 40s, with leagues forming in cities and towns across America. Factories sponsored teams, as did churches, neighborhoods, and social clubs. League night meant gathering with teammates, competing against rival teams, and socializing afterward. Bowling alleys became community centers, with the crash of pins, smell of lane oil, and clouds of cigarette smoke creating a distinctive atmosphere. Automatic pin-setting machines were still rare, so pin boys, often teenagers earning money, manually reset pins after each roll. The sport was accessible regardless of skill level, affordable, and could be enjoyed by men and women, young and old. Bowlers developed their own balls, shoes, and bags, taking the sport seriously while keeping it fun. Tournaments and award ceremonies celebrated excellence. For workers whose jobs were physically demanding or monotonous, bowling provided active recreation and team camaraderie. The post-war years would see bowling explode even more in popularity, but the 40s laid foundations for its mid-century golden age. 57. Miniature golf and roadside attractions. Despite, or perhaps because of wartime stress, Americans sought simple pleasures, and miniature golf provided affordable entertainment for families. Courses featured whimsical obstacles, windmills, castles, tunnels that required skill and provided laughs. Gas rationing limited long trips, so local attractions became more important for recreation. Miniature golf courses often appeared near ice cream stands, hot dog joints, and other small businesses catering to families looking for an evening's entertainment. A round of mini-golf cost a quarter or less, making it accessible even to those on tight budgets. Parents played alongside children, and teenagers made it part of dating rituals. Course designs grew increasingly creative, with some becoming local landmarks known for particular challenging holes. The simplicity was part of the appeal, no special equipment needed. Just rent a putter and ball and try your luck. These small pleasures helped maintain normalcy during abnormal times, giving families ways to be together and have fun despite larger worries. The miniature golf fad would peak in the 50s, but was already establishing itself as an American tradition. 58. Fishing and hunting as pastimes. Outdoor recreation in the 40s often meant fishing and hunting, activities that combined sport, nature appreciation, and practical food gathering. Many Americans grew up learning to fish from parents or grandparents, and skills were passed down through generations. Fishing required minimal equipment, a rod, line, hooks, and bait, and could be done from a riverbank or simple boat. It offered quiet time alone or with family, patience, and the satisfaction of catching dinner. Hunting season brought men into fields and forests pursuing deer, rabbits, ducks, or whatever game local areas offered. With meat rationed, wild game helped feed families, making hunting both recreation and contribution. Conservation ethics were developing, with licensing and seasons protecting wildlife populations. Outdoor magazines like Field and Stream published stories that romanticized hunting and fishing as connections to America's frontier heritage. These activities took people away from cities and war news into natural settings where simple rhythms and challenges provided perspective. The equipment and techniques of the era seem primitive now, but the appeal being outdoors, testing skills, providing for family remains timeless. 59. Roller skating rinks. Roller skating rinks provided entertainment for all ages, with regular sessions, live organ music, and a wholesome atmosphere that parents approved. Teenagers flocked to rinks for skating and socializing. Couples held hands during couples-only skates, and children circled the rink building confidence and speed. The rink featured a large wooden floor, rental skates that clamped onto shoes, and often a snack bar selling popcorn and sodas. Skating required skill and balance, with beginners clinging to railings while experienced skaters showed off with spins and backward skating. Rink culture had its own etiquette and social hierarchies, with regular skaters knowing each other and forming groups. Some rinks held theme nights or competitions. The activity provided exercise and fun in a supervised environment, important for parents concerned about what teenagers were doing. The 40s saw roller skating peak as a popular activity, with rinks in most towns and cities. The wholesome image sometimes masked the fact that rinks were places where young people could meet and flirt, making them social scenes as much as athletic venues. 60. Bridge and card games. Card games provided home entertainment before television, with bridge occupying a special place in middle-class social life. Bridge clubs met regularly, with serious players studying strategy and keeping track of points over multiple sessions. Hosting a bridge evening meant preparing refreshments and ensuring card tables were set up properly. The game required concentration, partnership, and skill, providing intellectual challenge. Other card games were popular too. Poker games among men involved betting and cigar smoke, while families played rummy or hearts together. Solitaire occupied individuals during quiet moments. Playing cards were inexpensive entertainment, and a deck lasted years with care. Card games appeared everywhere in military barracks, on trains, at kitchen tables. They filled evenings and social occasions, requiring nothing but cards, players, and time. The conventions and rules created structured social interaction, with everyone understanding expectations. In an era before passive electronic entertainment dominated leisure time, card games kept minds active and provided frameworks for socializing. The tradition of game night with friends or family made cards an important part of American social life. Politics and major events shaped the decade's course. 61. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fourth term. Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke with tradition in 1940 when he ran for a third term, and he did it again in 1944, seeking and winning a fourth. No president had ever served more than 2 terms, following an unwritten rule established by George Washington. Roosevelt's unprecedented tenure reflected the extraordinary times leading the nation through the Depression and now World War II. His fourth inauguration in January 1945 was a subdued affair held at the White House rather than the Capitol, with Roosevelt visibly weakened by illness. He appeared thin and exhausted, the strain of war leadership taking obvious toll. Less than 3 months later, on April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly at Warm Springs, Georgia. The nation mourned deeply, having known no other president for most people under 25. His death came just weeks before Germany's surrender, meaning he wouldn't see the war's end. Harry Truman suddenly became president, inheriting decisions about atomic weapons and post-war order. Roosevelt's long presidency had transformed both the office and the relationship between federal government and citizens, establishing precedents that would shape American politics for generations. 62. D-Day and the Normandy Invasion. June 6, 1944 D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing over 150,000 troops on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast of France. The operation had been planned for months, requiring enormous coordination of men, ships, aircraft, and supplies. General Dwight Eisenhower commanded the operation, making the final decision to proceed despite uncertain weather. Paratroopers dropped inland during the night, and at dawn landing craft hit the beaches. Some landings met light resistance, but at Omaha Beach, German defenses inflicted terrible casualties on American troops who fought for every yard. By day's end, the Allies had established a foothold, though at significant cost. Back home, Americans listened to radio reports and attended church services, praying for the troops. The invasion opened a second front in Europe, putting enormous pressure on Germany fighting the Soviets in the east. D-Day entered history as a moment when courage and sacrifice turned the war's tide, though hard fighting remained before victory. The image of troops wading ashore under fire became iconic, representing both the horror and necessity of the war. 63. The Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, just as it seemed Germany was nearly defeated, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge in Allied lines. The attack caught Allied forces off guard during terrible winter weather. German troops pushed deep into Belgium, surrounding American forces at Bastogne. When Germans demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously responded with a single word: nuts. American troops held despite being outnumbered and low on supplies. The weather cleared enough for air support to resume, and reinforcements arrived. The battle raged through January 1945 in brutal winter conditions before Allied forces pushed Germans back. The offensive failed, costing Germany irreplaceable men and equipment, hastening their final defeat. For Americans, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that even a cornered enemy remained dangerous, and that victory required vigilance and sacrifice until the very end. It was the largest battle fought by the U.S. Army, with nearly 90,000 American casualties. News of the surprise attack shocked the home front, where many had expected the war to end soon, reminding everyone that nothing could be taken for granted. 64. VE Day. Victory in Europe. May 8, 1945, brought the news Americans had awaited for years. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. VE Day victory in Europe sparked celebrations across the United States. People poured into streets, strangers embraced, church bells rang, and impromptu parades formed. Times Square in New York filled with celebrating crowds. After years of sacrifice, rationing, and worry, the European war was finally over. The joy was real, but tempered. The war against Japan continued, and everyone knew soldiers would die in the Pacific before complete victory came. Gold Star families who had lost sons in Europe felt the day differently, their sacrifices acknowledged but their losses permanent. Newspapers printed massive headlines, and President Truman addressed the nation, cautioning that work remained. Factories kept producing war materials because the Pacific War demanded continued effort. The celebration lasted a day or two, then Americans returned to work, knowing the job wasn't finished. VE Day split the war years, marking a milestone without bringing complete peace. The relief was enormous, but final victory still waited across the Pacific. 65. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and VJ Day. In early August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9, unleashing destruction of unprecedented scale. The bombs killed over 200,000 people, mostly civilians, and demonstrated weapons of almost incomprehensible power. Japan surrendered on August 15, and official ceremonies took place on September 2 aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. VJ Day brought pure jubilation. The war was finally completely over. Celebrations eclipsed even VE Day, with kissing sailors and dancing crowds immortalized in photographs. Servicemen would come home, rationing would end, and normal life could resume. The relief and joy were universal and profound. Yet the atomic bombs introduced moral complexity that would haunt the nuclear age. Questions about whether using them was necessary or justified began immediately and continue today. The bombs ended the war, but started the nuclear era, giving humanity the power to destroy itself. For those celebrating in August 45, though, these philosophical questions lay in the future. The immediate feeling was simply, the war is over, we won, our loved ones can come home. 66. The GI Bill transforms America. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, provided returning veterans with education benefits, low-cost mortgages, and unemployment assistance. The law transformed American society, enabling millions of veterans to attend college who otherwise couldn't have afforded it. Universities expanded rapidly to accommodate the flood of veteran students, who brought maturity and focus that raised academic standards. The education benefits helped create a massive expansion of the middle class, as veterans earned degrees leading to professional careers. The mortgage provisions enabled home purchases, fueling suburban development and making homeownership attainable for average families. The GI Bill represented a compact between government and veterans' recognition that those who served deserved support in rebuilding civilian lives. It worked spectacularly, generating economic returns far exceeding its cost as educated veterans drove prosperity. However, the benefits were not distributed equally. Discrimination in housing and education meant black veterans often couldn't access the same opportunities as white veterans, perpetuating racial disparities even as the bill helped millions. The GI Bill's success made it a model for social policy, demonstrating how government investment in citizens could generate widespread prosperity. 67. The founding of the United Nations. In April 1945, representatives from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to draft the Charter for the United Nations, an organization intended to prevent future world wars through collective security and diplomacy. The League of Nations had failed after World War I, but leaders hoped a new structure with greater authority and American participation might succeed. The UN Charter was signed in June and came into effect in October, establishing the Security Council, General Assembly, and various specialized agencies. The organization represented idealistic hopes that nations could resolve disputes through dialogue rather than violence. Eleanor Roosevelt played a crucial role in promoting the UN and later helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN's creation reflected wartime determination that such devastation must never happen again. Americans supported the organization initially, seeing it as essential for lasting peace. The reality proved more complicated. Cold War tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union, both holding Security Council vetoes, often paralyzed the UN. Still, the organization provided forums for international cooperation and a framework for addressing global challenges. Its founding embodied the hope and idealism of the immediate post-war moment, before the challenges of peace became apparent. 68. The Yalta Conference. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in Crimea to discuss post-war arrangements while fighting continued. The Big Three negotiated agreements about how Europe would be reorganized after Germany's defeat. Stalin promised to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, a promise he didn't keep, agreed to enter the war against Japan after Germany's surrender, and negotiated the division of Germany into occupation zones. The conference produced agreements that shaped the post-war world, including early plans for the United Nations. At Yalta, photographs showed Roosevelt looking frail and ill. He would die 2 months later. Some later criticized the Yalta agreements as conceding too much to Stalin, allowing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. The conference became controversial as the Cold War developed, and critics claimed Roosevelt had been naive or weak in dealing with Stalin. Defenders argued Roosevelt negotiated the best deal possible given Soviet military control of Eastern Europe. Regardless of later controversies, Yalta represented a moment when Allied unity still existed before Cold War divisions hardened. The conference attempted to plan peace before war even ended, an enormous challenge that produced imperfect but necessary compromises. 69. The Nuremberg Trials. Beginning in November 1945, the victorious Allies put Nazi leaders on trial in Nuremberg, Germany, for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the Holocaust. The trials were unprecedented. Never before had national leaders been held legally accountable for their actions during war. 24 major Nazi officials faced charges, with Hermann Göring the most prominent among them. The trials revealed the full extent of Nazi atrocities, including systematic genocide of Jews and other groups. Evidence included documents, photographs, and films that shocked the world. The prosecution established legal precedents about following orders not being a defense for committing atrocities. 12 defendants received death sentences, 7 got prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. Göring committed suicide before his execution. The trials served multiple purposes: punishing guilty individuals, establishing facts about Nazi crimes, and creating legal frameworks for addressing war crimes. They affirmed principles of international law and individual responsibility. Some criticized the trials as victor's justice, but they represented a serious attempt to apply legal process rather than simple revenge. Subsequent trials addressed additional defendants, including concentration camp personnel and business leaders who had profited from slave labor. Nuremberg established precedents that would influence international law and war crimes tribunals for decades. 70. The Iron Curtain descends. As World War II ended, wartime alliances quickly crumbled into Cold War hostility. The Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern European countries, installing communist governments and rejecting Western influence. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, coining the phrase "Iron Curtain" to describe the division between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and the democratic West. The speech crystallized growing awareness that the Soviet Union was not a partner for peace but a potential enemy. Americans who had celebrated cooperation with Uncle Joe Stalin during the war faced the jarring reality that the Soviet Union's goals conflicted fundamentally with American values and interests. The shift from World War II ally to Cold War adversary happened remarkably quickly, leaving many confused about why yesterday's friend was today's enemy. Communist expansion in Eastern Europe, Soviet espionage revelations, and competing visions of post-war order drove the nations apart. By the late 40s, the Cold War was firmly established, with the world divided into competing blocs. The nuclear age made this competition uniquely dangerous, as both sides developed atomic weapons. The hope of the immediate post-war moment that peace would be lasting and cooperative faded into confrontation that would define international relations for 40 years. Medical advances during the decade saved countless lives. 71. The polio epidemic and iron lungs. Polio haunted parents throughout the 40s, the disease striking seemingly at random, often affecting children. Poliomyelitis attacked the nervous system, sometimes causing paralysis or death. No one knew exactly how it spread, though it seemed to peak during summer months. Swimming pools and movie theaters sometimes closed during outbreaks, as communities tried to prevent transmission. The most severe cases required iron lungs, large metal tanks that mechanically breathed for patients whose chest muscles were paralyzed. Rows of iron lungs in hospital wards became one of the decade's most frightening images. Some patients spent weeks or months in these machines. A few never escaped them, spending years or entire lifetimes dependent on mechanical breathing. President Roosevelt himself had been paralyzed by polio in 1921, though he largely hid his disability from the public. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, promoted by Roosevelt, funded research and care. Every cough or fever sent parents into panic, wondering if this was the start of polio. The disease wouldn't be conquered until Jonas Salk developed a vaccine in the 1950s, but throughout the 40s it remained a terrifying threat to children and families. 72. Tuberculosis sanatoriums. Tuberculosis remained a major health threat in the 40s, with no reliable cure available. The standard treatment involved rest, fresh air, good nutrition, and isolation in sanatoriums, specialized hospitals usually located in mountain or rural areas thought to have healing climates. Patients spent months or years at these facilities, separated from families, while their lungs hopefully healed. TB sanatoriums became their own communities, with patients forming relationships, following strict regimens, and hoping for improvement. Some patients recovered enough to leave, while others deteriorated and died. The disease carried social stigma due to its contagiousness and association with poverty and crowded living conditions. Diagnosis meant potential job loss and isolation from community. Chest X-rays became a screening tool, and mobile X-ray units traveled to schools and workplaces to identify cases early. The discovery that streptomycin could treat TB came in 1944, offering the first real hope for cure, though it took years before the treatment became widely available and effective. Until antibiotics conquered TB in the 50s, sanatoriums remained necessary, and families lived with the fear of the disease that had killed millions throughout history. 73. Fluoride and dental health. The 1940s saw the beginning of water fluoridation, a public health measure that would dramatically reduce tooth decay. Studies had shown that communities with naturally occurring fluoride in water had fewer cavities, leading to experiments with adding fluoride to public water supplies. Grand Rapids, Michigan, began fluoridating in 1945, with other cities following. The measure proved controversial, with some opposing it as government overreach or expressing unfounded health concerns. But the results were undeniable. Children drinking fluoridated water developed significantly fewer cavities. Dental health improved dramatically over subsequent decades as fluoridation spread. In the 40s, dental care was often crude by modern standards, with extraction common for problem teeth and pain management limited. Many adults had lost multiple teeth by middle age, making dentures common. The idea that simple water treatment could prevent cavities seemed almost miraculous. Fluoride toothpaste also became more common. These advances, combined with better understanding of oral hygiene, began a transformation in dental health that would make the next generation's teeth vastly better than their parents'. Public health officials considered fluoridation one of the century's greatest achievements, despite persistent opposition from some quarters. 74. Mental health and shell shock. World War II forced greater recognition of mental health issues as tens of thousands of soldiers returned with what was then called shell shock or battle fatigue. What we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had functioned well before combat came home unable to work, plagued by nightmares, startled by loud noises, struggling to readjust to civilian life. The scale of the problem was impossible to ignore, though understanding remained limited and treatment rudimentary. Veterans Administration hospitals established psychiatric wards, and therapies ranged from talk therapy to controversial treatments like electroshock and insulin shock therapy. Some families found their returning soldier had become a stranger, withdrawn or volatile. The stigma around mental health meant many men suffered silently, afraid to admit psychological wounds. The experience drove some advances in psychiatry and psychology, as professionals struggled to help these veterans. Freudian psychoanalysis was popular among psychiatrists, though its effectiveness was questionable. The decade began loosening the silence around mental illness, though full understanding and effective treatments remained years away. The military's recognition that combat could psychologically damage even strong men represented progress, even if help remained inadequate. These veteran struggles highlighted that war's costs extended beyond physical wounds. 75. Antibiotics revolution. Beyond penicillin, the 40s saw development of other antibiotics that would transform medicine. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, proved effective against tuberculosis and other infections penicillin couldn't treat. Additional antibiotics followed as researchers screened soil samples and other sources for microorganisms that produced infection-fighting compounds. The speed of development was remarkable, driven by wartime necessity and pharmaceutical competition. Each new antibiotic expanded the range of treatable diseases. Bacterial pneumonia, which had routinely killed patients, became survivable. Infections that once meant amputation could now be cured with pills or injections. Childbirth became safer, as puerperal fever became treatable. Sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea could be cured rather than just managed. The revolution happened so quickly that doctors who had practiced a decade felt they were in a different profession. Pharmaceutical companies recognized the enormous commercial potential and invested heavily in research. Not all consequences were foreseen. Antibiotic overuse and resistance would later create problems. But in the 40s, antibiotics seemed like pure miracle, one of humanity's greatest victories over disease. The infectious diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia suddenly seemed conquerable, changing the entire landscape of medical practice and human life expectancy. That had plagued humanity for millennia suddenly seemed conquerable, changing the entire landscape of medical practice and human life expectancy. 76. Blood typing and transfusion safety. The 1940s saw widespread implementation of blood typing systems that made transfusions safer and more effective. Karl Landsteiner's discovery of blood types had occurred decades earlier, but wartime necessity drove systematic blood typing, cross-matching, and the establishment of reliable blood banking infrastructure. Every soldier's blood type was recorded on their dog tags, allowing medics to give appropriate transfusions in emergency situations. The knowledge that blood had to be matched by type A, B, AB, or O, and Rh positive or negative saved countless lives by preventing transfusion reactions that had previously killed patients. The discovery of the Rh factor in 1940 opened understanding of complications in pregnancy when mother and baby had incompatible blood types. Home front blood drives collected millions of pints, with donors proudly displaying buttons showing they'd given blood. Refrigeration and preservation techniques improved, allowing blood to be stored and transported. The infrastructure created during wartime became permanent, establishing blood donation and transfusion as routine medical practices. The safety and availability of blood transfusions transformed surgery, trauma care, and treatment of conditions like anemia, making possible medical interventions that would have been too dangerous before reliable transfusion existed. 77. Vitamin research and nutrition science. The 40s advanced scientific understanding of vitamins and nutrition, knowledge put to practical use, feeding military forces, and maintaining civilian health during shortages. Researchers identified essential vitamins and minerals, understanding their roles in preventing diseases like scurvy, rickets, and pellagra. The military used this knowledge to design rations that, while not always appetizing, provided necessary nutrients to keep soldiers healthy in challenging conditions. Enrichment of common foods began. Bread and flour were fortified with B vitamins and iron, milk with vitamin D. These simple interventions improved public health significantly, reducing deficiency diseases in the general population. Nutrition education spread through government programs, teaching homemakers how to maximize nutritional value despite rationing. The basic 7 food groups were promoted as guidelines for healthy eating. Vitamin supplements became more common, though expensive for many families. Scientists worked to understand how vitamins functioned in the body and what quantities were needed. This research laid groundwork for modern nutritional science, though some recommendations would be revised with further research. The decade's emphasis on nutrition reflected both scientific advancement and practical necessity of keeping populations healthy during wartime stress and food restrictions. 78. X-ray technology advances. X-ray technology improved significantly during the 40s, becoming more widely available and safer for patients and operators. Portable X-ray units reached remote areas and could be brought to patients unable to travel to hospitals. The military used mobile X-ray units extensively, diagnosing injuries and illnesses at field hospitals near combat zones. Civilian applications expanded, with chest X-rays becoming standard for tuberculosis screening and many workplaces requiring them for employees. Dentists increasingly used X-rays to identify cavities and tooth problems invisible to visual examination. Fluoroscopy allowed doctors to view internal organs in real time, guiding procedures and diagnoses. Radiologists developed expertise in interpreting X-ray images, becoming specialists in identifying fractures, tumors, and other conditions. The technology wasn't without risks. Radiation exposure dangers were not fully understood, and some people received excessive exposure from repeated X-rays or from working with the equipment without proper protection. Still, the benefits were enormous, giving doctors the ability to see inside the body without surgery. X-rays became an indispensable diagnostic tool, and continued refinements throughout the decade improved image quality while reducing radiation doses. The technology represented medicine's increasing ability to understand body's internal workings without invasive procedures. 79. Psychiatric hospitals and mental institutions. Mental health care in the 40s centered on large state psychiatric hospitals where thousands of patients lived, often for years or entire lifetimes. These institutions warehoused people with severe mental illness, intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, and sometimes simply those whose families couldn't manage them. Conditions varied widely. Some hospitals made genuine efforts at treatment and humane care, while others were overcrowded, underfunded nightmares where patients received minimal care. Treatments included occupational therapy, some talk therapy, and controversial interventions like lobotomies and electroshock therapy. Lobotomies, which involved destroying brain tissue, were performed on thousands of patients despite limited evidence of effectiveness and significant risks. The procedure's inventor won the Nobel Prize in 1949, though the operation would later be recognized as deeply harmful. Electroshock therapy, while sometimes effective for severe depression, was also used as punishment and control. Mental patients had few rights, and commitment could be involuntary and indefinite. Families sometimes visited regularly, but others abandoned relatives to these institutions. The system reflected society's uncertainty about mental illness, a combination of medical facility, social welfare, and containment. Reform would come in later decades, but the 40s were still an era when mental illness meant possible lifelong institutionalization with questionable treatment. 80. Prenatal care and maternal health. The 40s saw increased emphasis on prenatal care, with doctors encouraging pregnant women to have regular checkups throughout pregnancy. Maternal and infant mortality rates, while still concerning, were declining due to better medical care and understanding. Prenatal vitamins became standard recommendations. Hospitals had maternity wards with trained obstetric nurses, and doctors could monitor pregnancies for complications. Most births still occurred in hospitals rather than homes, a shift that had begun in the 30s and continued. Hospitals offered pain relief during labor, though natural childbirth advocates questioned whether medical interventions were always necessary. The presence of fathers in delivery rooms was rare. Men typically waited outside while their wives gave birth, pacing in waiting rooms until a nurse brought news. Formula feeding was increasingly promoted as modern and scientific, though breastfeeding remained common, particularly in rural areas and lower-income families. Bottle sterilization and formula preparation became rituals in homes with new babies. Government programs promoted maternal health, recognizing that healthy mothers meant healthy children and contributed to national strength. Still, racial disparities in maternal care meant that black women faced higher risks and often received inferior care in segregated facilities. Progress was real but uneven, reflecting broader social inequalities. Family life and education reflected both continuity and change. 81. The baby boom begins. As servicemen returned from war and reunited with wives or married sweethearts, they'd waited years to wed. America's birth rates surged dramatically. The baby boom, which would define American demographics for decades, began in earnest in 1946. Hospitals filled with newborns, obstetricians stayed busy, and baby product manufacturers couldn't keep up with demand. The GI Bill enabled veterans to afford homes and families, contributing to the boom. Young couples who had postponed starting families during Depression and war years now felt optimistic about the future. The sudden jump in births strained hospital maternity wards and would eventually challenge schools, housing, and every aspect of society as this massive generation moved through life stages together. For the late 40s, though, it meant nurseries filled with crying babies, neighborhoods full of young families, and an explosion of products and services for children. Diaper services, baby food companies, toy manufacturers, all thrived. The optimism that produced the baby boom reflected confidence in America's future and belief that prosperity would continue. These babies born in the late 40s would come of age in the 60s, bringing their own transformative impact on American culture. 82. Suburban development begins. The late 40s saw the beginning of suburban development that would transform American living patterns. Levittown, New York, begun in 1947, became the prototype for mass-produced suburban housing. Builder William Levitt applied assembly line techniques to home construction, creating thousands of similar houses quickly and affordably. Veterans could buy these homes with low-cost GI Bill mortgages, making home ownership accessible to working-class families who couldn't have afforded it before. The houses were small, around 750 square feet initially, but they were new, had yards, and represented the American dream. Suburbs offered escape from crowded cities, space for children to play, and the pride of owning rather than renting. The development of suburbs required cars, as most lacked public transportation, connecting suburban growth to automobile ownership. Shopping centers began appearing to serve suburban communities. Critics later identified problems with suburbs: racial segregation, environmental costs, social isolation. But in the late 40s, suburbs represented hope and progress. Young families eagerly moved to these new developments, establishing communities and living patterns that would define mid-century American life. The suburban explosion was just beginning, but its foundations were laid in the late 40s. 83. One-room schoolhouses and rural education. Despite urban growth, many American children in the 40s still attended one-room schoolhouses where a single teacher instructed all grades together. These schools served rural and remote areas where populations were too sparse for larger facilities. The teacher, often a young woman boarding with a local family, managed students ranging from 1st through 8th grade, somehow teaching different lessons to different age groups simultaneously. Older students helped younger ones, creating a family-like atmosphere. The schoolhouse often served as a community center for meetings and social events. Facilities were basic outhouses for bathrooms, wood or coal stoves for heat, and perhaps a well for water. Students brought lunches in pails, and the school day followed agricultural rhythms, with shortened schedules during planting and harvest seasons when children were needed on farms. These schools provided education despite limited resources, and many successful Americans received their early education in one-room schoolhouses. As rural populations declined and school consolidation advanced, these schools gradually disappeared, but in the 40s, thousands still operated, maintaining a tradition stretching back to the frontier era. They represented American determination that all children deserved education, regardless of how remote their location. 84. The paperback book revolution. Pocketbooks, launched in 1939, transformed American reading habits during the 40s. These affordable paperbacks cost 25 cents and fit in a pocket or purse, making books accessible to people who couldn't afford hardcovers or lacked access to libraries. The books were sold, not just in bookstores but in drugstores, newsstands, bus stations, and anywhere people might impulse buy. Soldiers carried paperbacks overseas. They were lightweight, disposable, and provided portable entertainment. Publishers produced armed services editions, specifically for military distribution, printing millions of books. The selection ranged from classic literature to mysteries, westerns, and romance novels. Paperbacks democratized reading, bringing books to working-class readers and making literature part of everyday life rather than elite culture. The format proved wildly successful, and multiple publishers entered the market. Covers often featured lurid illustrations, designed to catch eyes on crowded racks, sometimes bearing little relation to the book's contents. Literary snobs dismissed paperbacks as lowbrow, but they created readers and kept publishing profitable. Many people discovered serious literature through paperback editions they could afford. The paperback revolution changed publishing, economics, and reading culture, making the 1940s a crucial decade in American literacy and book culture. 85. Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care. In 1946, Dr. Benjamin Spock published The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which revolutionized American parenting. The book's advice contradicted prevailing rigid approaches that emphasized schedules and avoiding spoiling children. Spock encouraged parents to trust their instincts, be affectionate with children, and recognize that babies' needs mattered. His opening line, "You know more than you think you do," reassured anxious parents. The book sold for 25 cents in paperback, making it accessible to nearly everyone, and it became one of the best-selling books in American history. Spock's permissive approach influenced how baby-boom children were raised, emphasizing flexibility and emotional warmth over strict discipline. Critics later blamed Spock for supposedly creating self-indulgent generations, though research didn't support these claims. The book's immediate success reflected parents' hunger for practical, reassuring guidance. Spock addressed common concerns, feeding, sleeping, illnesses, behavior problems, in clear, accessible language. He normalized variations in children's development and reduced anxiety about minor deviations from average. For millions of parents, Spock's book became the authoritative guide, more influential than their own parents' advice. The book's publication marked a shift toward more child-centered parenting that would characterize the post-war era. 86. High school graduation rates rising. High school graduation rates increased significantly during the 40s, reflecting growing recognition that education beyond 8th grade was necessary for economic opportunity. In earlier decades, many young people left school after 8th grade to work, but by the 40s, completing high school was becoming expected for middle-class children. Urban areas had established comprehensive high schools, offering academic and vocational tracks. Rural areas consolidated one-room schools into larger facilities that could offer high school education. The GI Bill's education benefits demonstrated the value of college, creating incentives for high school completion. High school became a distinct life stage with its own culture proms, yearbooks, sports teams, and social hierarchies. Teenagers formed a recognized demographic, neither children nor adults, with their own interests and concerns. Not everyone completed high school. Many working-class and rural youth still left early for economic reasons, and racial segregation meant unequal educational opportunities. African American students in the South attended separate, underfunded schools with fewer resources and lower graduation rates. Still, the trend toward universal high school education was clear, establishing an expectation that would become nearly universal in subsequent decades. 87. School cafeterias and hot lunch programs. School lunch programs expanded during the 40s, providing hot meals to students who might otherwise go hungry or bring inadequate lunches. The National School Lunch Act, passed in 1946, federalized what had been local initiatives, reflecting recognition that proper nutrition aided learning and that feeding children was a legitimate government responsibility. Cafeterias served basic but nutritious meals: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, vegetables, milk, and dessert at minimal cost or free for those who couldn't pay. For many children, school lunch was their best meal of the day. Cafeteria workers, usually women, cooked from scratch, peeling potatoes and baking fresh rolls. The smell of cafeteria food, sometimes appetizing, sometimes less so, became part of school memory for millions of children. Lunchtime was also social time, with students sitting with friends, trading food items, and navigating childhood social dynamics. The program served multiple purposes: ensuring children received adequate nutrition, supporting agricultural markets by purchasing surplus commodities, and helping the next generation grow healthy and strong. The establishment of school lunch as a government program reflected New Deal-era beliefs in active government support for citizens' welfare, principles that continued into the post-war era despite growing political conservatism. 88. Library services and bookmobiles. Public libraries served as community centers and educational resources, offering free access to books, magazines, and newspapers. Librarians helped patrons find information and recommended books, serving as information specialists before the term existed. Many cities had impressive library buildings with reading rooms where students studied and adults researched. Children's sections welcomed young readers, with librarians conducting story hours that introduced children to literature. Bookmobiles extended library services to rural areas and underserved neighborhoods, bringing books directly to communities lacking library buildings. These mobile libraries, usually converted buses or trucks, followed regular routes, allowing people to check out and return books. The bookmobile's arrival was an event, especially for children eager to select new reading material. Libraries faced challenges: limited budgets, book shortages due to wartime paper restrictions, and sometimes censorship controversies over controversial books. Segregation meant that in the South, black residents were excluded from white libraries or served through separate, inferior facilities. Despite limitations, libraries represented democracy's promise that knowledge should be freely available to all. In an era before internet or widespread television, libraries were crucial for education, entertainment, and self-improvement, serving communities in ways that would diminish but never entirely disappear. 89. Family dinner and table rituals. The family dinner held central importance in 40s households, with everyone expected to gather for the evening meal. Mothers, and it was almost always mothers, prepared dinners from scratch, often cooking meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. Meals followed patterns: roast on Sunday, meatloaf on Monday using leftover roast, soup midweek, fish on Friday for Catholic families. Everyone sat at assigned places, and table manners were enforced. Children learned to wait until everyone was served, not to reach across the table, to eat what they were given, and not to leave until excused. Conversation happened around the table. Fathers asked about children's school days, news of the day was discussed, and family decisions were made. The dinner table was where family cohesion was maintained and values transmitted. No television distracted attention. Few families had sets until the late 40s, and radio might be off during dinner. The ritual emphasized family unity and proper behavior, teaching children social skills they'd need throughout life. Not every family managed nightly dinners together. Shift work, multiple jobs, or other circumstances intervened, but the ideal remained powerful. The family dinner represented stability and tradition in a rapidly changing world, a daily ceremony that marked home as a refuge from outside pressures. 90. toy trains, and childhood play. Children's toys in the 40s reflected both pre-war traditions and wartime influences. Toy trains, particularly Lionel electric trains, were prized Christmas gifts for boys, with elaborate layouts built on plywood sheets in basement. Fathers and sons bonded over building miniature worlds with tracks, tunnels, bridges, and tiny towns. Girls received dolls, doll houses, and play kitchens, reinforcing gender roles. Toy soldiers and military-themed toys proliferated during and immediately after the war, allowing children to act out battles and play at being soldiers. Board games like Monopoly, created in the Depression, remained popular. Outdoor toys included bicycles, roller skates, jump ropes, and balls for various sports. Many toys were simpler than today's wooden blocks. Lincoln logs, erector sets for building. Children made their own entertainment more than later generations would, creating games and adventures with minimal equipment. Comic books and radio serials fired imaginations, inspiring play scenarios. Gender divisions in toys were strict. Boys playing with dolls or girls with soldiers would have been discouraged. The toy industry was smaller and less commercialized than it would become, with many toys passed down through siblings or homemade. Play reflected children's need to make sense of the world, including the war that dominated their early years, through imagination and role-playing. The decade's experiences created lasting changes in American culture. 91. The Great Migration continues. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern and western cities, which had begun during World War I, accelerated during the 40s. The war's industrial boom created job opportunities in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, and Los Angeles. Black Southerners fled Jim Crow segregation, violence, and limited economic prospects, seeking better lives in regions where, despite discrimination, opportunities seemed greater. The migration transformed American demographics and culture, bringing Southern black culture, music, food, church traditions to northern cities. Neighborhoods changed as black populations grew, sometimes triggering white flight. Racial tensions flared in cities unaccustomed to significant black populations, and competition for housing and jobs created conflict. Detroit experienced a serious race riot in 1943, yet the migration continued, with each wave of migrants sending word home about opportunities, encouraging others to follow. The demographic shift would eventually influence politics, as black voters gained power in northern cities. The migration also spread black cultural innovations, blues becoming urban and electric, gospel music developing new forms, and cultural cross-pollination that would later produce rock and roll. The 40s migration laid groundwork for civil rights movements of later decades, concentrating black populations where they could build political power and organize effectively. 92. Women's workforce participation. World War II brought millions of women into the workforce, many in jobs previously reserved for men. After the war, society pressured women to return home and make way for returning veterans, and many did leave paid employment. However, not all women left the workforce, and the war years had demonstrated women's capabilities in ways that couldn't be entirely erased. Working women had gained confidence, skills, and in some cases enjoyed the independence employment provided. Some continued working out of economic necessity: widows, single women, or those whose families needed dual incomes. The cultural narrative emphasized domesticity and motherhood as women's proper roles, and the late 40s saw celebration of housewives and homemaking. Yet the seed was planted, women had proven they could do men's work, and some never forgot that experience or the satisfaction of earning their own money. The tension between cultural expectations of femininity and women's demonstrated capabilities would simmer through the 50s and eventually erupt in second-wave feminism. The 40s thus represented both advancement and retreat. Women had opportunities they'd never had before, then saw those opportunities curtailed, creating a complex legacy that influenced gender relations for decades. 93. Racial integration of baseball. In April 1947, Jackie Robinson took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking Major League Baseball's color barrier. Robinson had been carefully selected by Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey, not just for his athletic ability, but for his character and ability to withstand the abuse he would inevitably face. He endured racist taunts from fans and opposing players, pitchers throwing at his head, and teammates who initially didn't want him on the team. Robinson responded with remarkable dignity and exceptional play, winning Rookie of the Year. His success opened doors for other black players, and within a few years, multiple teams had integrated. The integration of baseball was symbolically important. Far beyond sports, it demonstrated that black and white athletes could compete together, that excellence transcended race, and that integration could work. Robinson became a hero to black Americans, and to many whites who supported equality. Baseball's integration preceded broader civil rights victories by years, providing an example and proving that segregation's justifications were baseless. Other black players like Larry Doby, who integrated the American League, followed Robinson, and the talent pool expansion changed baseball's competitive balance. Teams that refused to integrate found themselves at disadvantage as black players' skills became obvious. Baseball's integration was neither complete nor immediate. Discrimination continued in many forms, but 1947 marked an irreversible turning point. 94. The rise of consumer culture. The late 40s saw the beginning of consumer culture's full flowering as wartime restrictions ended and prosperity grew. Americans who had endured depression, scarcity, and wartime rationing were ready to buy things: cars, appliances, homes, clothes, entertainment. Factories converted from war production to consumer goods, producing washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and other appliances that promised to make life easier. Advertising expanded dramatically, using increasingly sophisticated psychological techniques to create desire. New products constantly appeared, and planned obsolescence, designing products to wear out or become outdated, encouraged repeat purchases. Credit became more available, allowing purchases beyond immediate means. The culture emphasized acquisition and display of material goods as measures of success and sources of happiness. Shopping became recreation, and keeping up with neighbors drove consumption. Not everyone participated equally. Poverty remained real for many Americans, and wealth disparities meant consumer culture was primarily middle class, but the values of consumption influenced society broadly. The shift from Depression-era thrift to celebration of spending represented a fundamental cultural change. Americans embraced material abundance after years of scarcity, though critics worried about materialism and loss of deeper values. The consumer culture, taking shape in the late 40s, would dominate American life for decades. 95. Television's early days. Television existed in the late 40s, but remained rare and expensive, a luxury item for wealthy early adopters. Sets cost several $100s, a significant sum when average yearly income was perhaps $3,000. Programming was limited, broadcast only in largest cities, and available only a few hours daily. Early shows included variety programs, sporting events, news, and experimental drama. The images were black and white, small, and not particularly clear. Yet even these primitive televisions fascinated viewers. Neighbors gathered at homes with sets to watch broadcasts together, experiencing communal viewing that wouldn't last once sets became common. The potential was obvious. A medium combining radio's immediacy with visual images could be powerful. Television manufacturers ramped up production, prices gradually dropped, and broadcasting expanded. By the end of the decade, television's trajectory toward becoming a dominant medium was clear, though its full impact still lay ahead. The 40s were television's infancy, when the technology proved itself but hadn't yet transformed daily life. Radio remained dominant for news and entertainment, but television's arrival marked the beginning of the end of radio's golden age and the start of a new era in American culture. 96. The decline of downtown shopping. As suburbs developed and car ownership increased, traditional downtown shopping districts began a slow decline. Previously, downtown areas had been commercial and social centers where people shopped, conducted business, and socialized. Department stores anchored downtowns, offering multiple floors of merchandise in impressive buildings. In the late 40s, this pattern started shifting. Suburban shopping centers, beginning with basic strip malls, offered parking and convenience that downtown couldn't match. The change was gradual and uneven. Downtowns remained vital in the 40s, but the trend was emerging. The automobile changed shopping patterns, making distance less important than parking availability. City planning increasingly accommodated cars rather than pedestrians. Public transportation, crucial to downtown vitality, declined as car ownership grew. The shift would accelerate in the 50s and 60s, devastating many downtowns, but the seeds were planted in the 40s as returning veterans bought suburban homes and cars, establishing patterns that prioritized convenience over urban vitality. The implications extended beyond shopping. Weakening downtowns meant weakening city tax bases, contributing to urban decay that would plague many American cities. The late 40s didn't see the full effects, but the shift toward car-based, suburban living that would transform American geography and society was underway. 97. The creation of the modern teenager. The concept of teenager as a distinct life stage solidified during the 40s. Previously, adolescence had been seen as children or young adults, but not as a separate category with its own culture, needs, and identity. Several factors created modern teenagerhood. Extended high school education kept adolescents in school rather than working. Relative prosperity meant young people had spending money, and marketers recognized teenagers as a demographic worth targeting. Teen culture developed around high schools, with activities, athletics, dances, and social hierarchies creating a world somewhat separate from adults. Bobby Soxer's Screaming for Frank Sinatra demonstrated teenagers' distinctive tastes and behaviors. Teen magazines appeared, offering advice on fashion, dating, and social problems. The 40s teenager was more innocent than later generations would be, still largely supervised by parents, expected to conform to conventional morality, and limited in independence. Yet the basic template was established. Teenagers as a group with their own interests, spending power, and cultural influence. This would expand dramatically in subsequent decades, but the 40s created the category. The emergence of teenagers as a recognized stage reflected broader social changes, extended education, delayed workforce entry, and prosperity that allowed a period of semi-independence between childhood and full adulthood. 98. The roots of rock and roll. The music that would explode as rock and roll in the 1950s had roots in the 40s. Blues musicians were electrifying their instruments, increasing volume and intensity. Gospel music's emotional power influenced secular music. Country and Western music was reaching broader audiences. Jump blues and rhythm and blues, performed by artists like Louis Jordan and Wynonie Harris, featured driving rhythms and suggestive lyrics that anticipated rock and roll. Young people, both black and white, were listening to music that made them want to move, music that felt rebellious and exciting compared to their parents' sedate tastes. Record labels and radio stations serving black audiences, race records, and race radio played music that white teenagers increasingly discovered and loved. The musical cross-pollination that would create rock and roll was happening, though the synthesis hadn't yet occurred. The 40s laid groundwork, electric instruments, mixing of musical traditions, and young audiences hungry for energetic, emotionally direct music. When these elements combined in the early 50s, rock and roll would emerge. But the 40s were the crucial period when separate musical streams began flowing together. 99. Cold War anxiety and nuclear fear. The late 40s saw the beginning of Cold War anxiety that would haunt America for decades. The Soviet Union, former wartime ally, became an ideological enemy. Concern about communist expansion and Soviet intentions grew. The Berlin blockade of 1948 escalated tensions and made war seem possible. Americans worried about Soviet espionage. Some fears were justified, as Soviet spy rings did operate in the US, including some involved in stealing atomic secrets. Communism became a political issue, with politicians competing to appear tough on the threat. Loyalty oaths and security clearances spread. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated suspected communists, and accusations could destroy careers. Fear of nuclear war emerged as both the US and Soviets developed atomic weapons. Civil defense planning began, with discussions of how to survive atomic attack. Duck and cover drills in schools would come in the 50s, but the anxiety started in the late 40s. The optimism of immediate post-war peace faded into recognition that the world remained dangerous and that nuclear weapons made the danger existential. Americans adjusted to living with chronic low-level fear, trying to maintain normal lives, while aware that civilization could end in nuclear war. The psychological impact of this anxiety would shape Cold War-era culture profoundly. 100. The American Dream, redefined. The 1940s ultimately redefined the American dream. Before the war, the dream emphasized opportunity and possibility more than specific achievements, the chance to work hard and build a better life. The post-war dream became more concrete and material. A home in the suburbs, a car in the garage, modern appliances in the kitchen, children going to college, and retirement security. The G.I. Bill made this vision achievable for millions of veterans who might never have owned homes or attended college otherwise. Prosperity seemed sustainable, and optimism about the future was widespread. Yet the dream had limitations. It was most accessible to white men, while racial discrimination and gender expectations limited opportunities for others. The dream's materialism bothered some who valued less tangible goals, and achieving the dream required conformity to social expectations that some found stifling. Still, for those who had survived depression and war, the possibility of security and comfort represented enormous progress. The 40s established the template of middle-class American life that would dominate the 50s: suburban homes, nuclear families, stable employment, and consumption-driven lifestyle. This vision of the American dream, forged in the 40s, would define aspiration and drive culture for generations, even as it would eventually be questioned and challenged by those excluded from it or dissatisfied with its promises. These 100 facts paint a portrait of 1940s America, a decade of enormous challenge and remarkable transformation. From Pearl Harbor's shock to the atomic age's terrifying dawn, from wartime sacrifice to post-war prosperity, Americans experienced changes that would echo through generations. The decade's legacy includes both achievements to celebrate and injustices to confront, both progress and persistent problems. Understanding the 40s helps us understand modern America, for so much of what defines us was shaped in those crucial 10 years.